Hello. Well, I'm glad to be here with you today, and we are going to talk about, I must add, an excellent reference book. Some unique photos are included, which you'll get a chance to see, but it's the story of a group that are true American heroes and heroines, because there were women also. I didn't prepare. I don't prepare. I improvise. But I would like to read something to you, the introduction from the book. I think that'll capture where I'm going. During the early 20th century, many white military and civilian aviation experts were convinced that African Americans lacked the mental capacity, aptitude, and reflexes to fly airplanes. In fact, official studies done by the Army War College in the 1920s and 30s concluded that blacks were a mentally inferior subspecies of the human race, with smaller brains that weighed 10 ounces less than those of whites. These studies also rationalized that the few blacks who had become pilots were exception to the general rule and usually possessed a higher percentage of white blood. In short, the general feeling was that blacks were overwhelmed by aviation technology and inherently afraid of flight. In 1976, I was working here as the first black archivist, and I was in charge of civil archives, the civil records. And one day I was going through the Frank Dixon collection, and I ran across a file drawer full of correspondence to Governor Frank Dixon. So I began to scan through the correspondence, and mainly the letters, postcards, were in opposition to the establishment of an aviation program at Tuskegee for the training of African Americans to fly. Hindsight. Most of the letters reflected what I just read. This is 1940-41. They disregarded the accomplishment of Jock Eugene Bullock from Phoenix City, who couldn't fly for the American Expeditionary Forces, so he went and flew for the French. There's a great exhibit out at Gunner in the enlisted Heritage Hall on Bullock, or the accomplishment of Elizabeth Bessie Coleman, or Chauncey Spencer, or Dale White. The South, and maybe the nation, at the time was consumed with Jim Crow, particularly this area, the South. And everything, every decision, every political decision was based on race. But people like R.R. Moden at Tuskegee, Frederick Patterson, who else am I forgetting? The presidents there, didn't believe this myth, or even future leaders like Noah Parrish believed that blacks could actually fly complex machines and contribute to the defense of this nation. So, with the coming of World War II, Roosevelt realized that we needed to arm this nation. He established a program called the Civilian Pilot Training Program, and Tuskegee was one of two HBCUs, that's Historical Black University, to acquire that training program. And they established training fields at Kennedy and Moulton Field and hired a man named Chief Charles Alfred Anderson. Mr. Haulman, Hugh Haulman back there, we were just talking about an interview of his. So, 59, Dan, am I right on the stat? Graduated from the civilian pilot training program. Through the lobbying of the NAACP and other organizations, the pilot training program was established at Tuskegee in 1941. And of course, Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had graduated from West Point, had gone through 4 years of silent treatment from the other cadets there. His dad had been ROTC commander at Tuskegee. And of course, you had Chief Anderson and George Washington, George Washington. And the legacy of Tuskegee itself, of self-sufficiency established by Booker T. Washington. So the pilot training program was established. They go out and hire a black engineering firm, McKissick & McKissick, clear the land, establish Tuskegee Army Airfield. But the university had Moulton Field, which provided the primary training, and then they would move to Tuskegee for the advanced training. So, Class 42C, 4 members, graduates, and they would be assigned to the famed 99th Fighter Squadron. They are overly trained, wanting to be deployed, wanting to fight for their country. Finally, the 99th is deployed to North Africa. The problems do not end there. General William Momar sends back report that they're inadequate, they can't fly. They break off, they don't protect the bombers, they blah, 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 blah. B.O. Davis, who's a colonel now, goes back to Washington and maintains the program. But I'm overstating because Dan, my co-author here, will talk about the operational side. But the training of pilots from 38 to 43 is a fascinating story. It challenges Jim Crow and refutes the studies that was done by the Army War College. Dan?
Okay, thank you, Joe. Appreciate it. I'm going to pick up where Joe left off. He was talking about the overall view of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we're both very fortunate to be working at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, and I want to mention that this is the best source of documents on Air Force organizations, such as those to which the Tuskegee Airmen belong. The 332nd Fighter Group and its 4 squadrons, the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd, and the 477th Bombardment Group and its 4 squadrons, the 616th, 617th, 618th, and 619th. I'm going to go through some slides now, show you some pictures covering some of the points that Joe already mentioned, and then get into the combat phase of the Tuskegee Airmen. Not all the Tuskegee Airmen went overseas. Not all of them flew fighter aircraft. But I want to talk a little bit about their combat experience overseas. This is a picture of the 3 authors. Unfortunately, Jerome Ennals wasn't able to join us today. He's the gentleman on the far right. And the man at the bottom of this picture is Herbert Carter, Gene Carter. He lives in Tuskegee. He's still living as an original Tuskegee Airman. And he came to the book signing when we had a reception at New South Books on May 5th. And we were very pleased. We didn't really expect him to show up, but he showed up. And we were very glad about that. The uniqueness of this book, and you can see the list of some of the reasons why this book is a little bit different from some others. It's, I would have to say, a little bit more accurate than some of the things that have been written about the Tuskegee Airmen. Some of them contain some inaccuracies that have been corrected by the research in this book. And it also focuses not only on the fighter pilots, but on also the bomber pilots and the ground personnel. And there were a lot more ground personnel than there were flying members of the Tuskegee Airmen. So this book covers them too. You'll see a lot of photographs with good captions about their contribution to the effort. There were a lot of men on the ground supporting every pilot that went up. It contains a detailed chronology. And three of the myths I want to mention very briefly about the Tuskegee Airmen. One of them is that they never lost a bomber. And research shows that there were occasions when sometimes Tuskegee Airmen or escorted bombers were shot down by enemy aircraft. Another one is that Lee Archer was an ace. Now, Lee Archer is a Tuskegee Airman I was able to meet several times. He knew he didn't have 5 victory credits, which usually qualifies a person for an ace, but he's still an aviation hero. He shot down 3 enemy aircraft in one day, on October 12, 1944, another one July 18, 1944. So he shot down 4 aircraft. In fact, there were 3 Tuskegee Airmen who shot down 4 aircraft, and there were 4 Tuskegee Airmen that shot down 3 in one day, which is quite commendable. The other myth is Roscoe Brown was the first American pilot to shoot down a German jet. Well, there's an element of truth in that. He was a Tuskegee Airman. He did shoot down a German jet, which is unusual for somebody flying a P-51 against a jet plane that could fly 100 miles per hour faster. But he wasn't the first American pilot to do that. He knew that, and he came to the agency. In fact, he was honored at Air University. Air Command and Staff College has a gathering of Eagles every year. And he was honored at the gathering of Eagles, and he did some research at the agency and looked at his own record, and he knew that there were some others who had shot down a German aircraft before him. But he was gracious enough to agree to write the foreword to the book. So he wrote the foreword to our book from an original Tuskegee Airman. And this is some information about him. He was at the ceremony in March 2007 when the Tuskegee Airmen were awarded, in the name of Congress, a gold medal for their contributions to the war effort and for their contributions in American history. And President George W. Bush at the time presented the medal on behalf of Congress. And in fact, Roscoe Brown was there representing the Tuskegee Airmen to accept the medal. There are a lot of statistics about the Tuskegee Airmen. I won't mention all of them right now because we have a lot of information to cover, but this is some of the information. They flew, for example, thousands of missions, 12th Air Force and 15th Air Force. For the 15th Air Force, which was the bomber escort mission, they flew 311 missions. They flew 179 bomber escort missions during that time. They shot down 112 enemy aircraft. This is including their experience with the 12th Air Force and later with the 15th Air Force. They earned 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses. This is an individual award earned by various members of the Tuskegee Airmen, 332nd Fighter Group and its 4 squadrons. And they also, the organizations themselves, earned a total of 3 Distinguished Unit Citations. The 99th Fighter Squadron earned 2 before the 332nd Fighter Group deployed overseas, and the 332nd Group earned another one. These are some of the pioneers in aviation history and black aviation history that Joe mentioned already. This is an aerial view of Tuskegee Army Airfield that was constructed between what is now Moton Field, the Tuskegee Airport, where the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site is, and Tallahassee. This is an aerial view of a field which is today in ruins. But it was the more important field. It was more important than Moton Field because Moton Field is where they had the primary training. Tuskegee Army Airfield was where they had the basic training and the advanced training. And this was a military airfield. It was much larger than Moton Field. It had 4 runways, whereas Moton Field had only 1. This is what it looks like today. There's almost nothing except a gate that shows what the what the base looked like. And the owners of the property erected that gate because they wanted people to remember what had happened at that very important site. The training that Joe already mentioned took place really at several fields. Originally at Kennedy Field in Tuskegee, owned by Tuskegee Institute. And then at Moton Field, the Tuskegee Airport, the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site today, is where the primary training took place. And a lot of the would-be Tuskegee Airmen washed out of that training because it was very rigorous. They wanted the individuals who entered flight training to be prepared for the combat flying that they would have to do. When they graduated from primary flight training at Moton Field, then they moved to Tuskegee Army Airfield where they had the basic and the advanced training. And they used different kinds of aircraft for that. And eventually they ended up flying the types of aircraft that they would eventually fly in combat. This is Noel Parrish. He was the head of Tuskegee Army Airfield, the head of the flying school there, and he was well remembered by a lot of the Tuskegee Airmen. Unlike some of the other commanders of the 332nd Fighter Group, for example, before it had black leadership, and some other leaders of other bases, Noel Parrish is remembered with fondness by the Tuskegee Airmen. In fact, the Tuskegee Airmen National Organization, the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, have an award they present every year, the Noel Parrish Award, in honor of Colonel Parrish, to a Tuskegee Airman who had done something outstanding that year or for his career contributions. The best-known Tuskegee Airman of all was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., and you can see a picture of him on the right there shaking hands with his father. His father, Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., was the first black Army general, and the first Air Force, black Air Force general, was his son eventually after the war. But Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was the best-known leader of the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. He led the 99th Fighter Squadron. Later, he was head of the 332nd Fighter Group. Later, he was head of the 477th Composite Group. And later, he was head of the 332nd Fighter Wing. So he was definitely the best known of the Tuskegee Airmen. He later went on to become the first black general in the Air Force. He wasn't the first black four-star general. We'll see a little bit more about that in a minute. The first class of pilots, black pilots, who graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield, there were only 5 of them. They were very important. One of them, of course, was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., and he's in that picture on the upper left. All of those Tuskegee Airmen became very important in combat, and that's what I want to talk about. This is class of 45A. You can see the number of graduates increased, the average size of the class from the advanced pilot training. They trained at other bases beyond Tuskegee, and because of time considerations, I'll just let you look at some of those. Some of them in Michigan, some of them in Kentucky and Ohio. This is an aerial view of Tuskegee Army Airfield, and if you look at a satellite map today of the field, you'll see it looks a little bit like this. You can see, you can make out where the runways used to be and where the streets on the base used to be. I want to talk mostly right now about the Tuskegee Airmen in combat. The first Tuskegee Airmen unit to enter combat was the 99th Fighter Squadron under the command of Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. by the time it deployed. It deployed to North Africa, then it went to Sicily, then it went to Italy. And it fought at first for the 12th Air Force, flying P-40 fighters. Those fighters were very good planes originally, but by the time the Tuskegee Airmen were flying them in combat, there were a lot of better planes that the enemy had. So they didn't have a lot of chance at the beginning to shoot down enemy aircraft. P-40s were used mainly for patrol, to protect forces on the ground, to protect shipping in the Mediterranean, or to attack certain enemy targets. When the 332nd Fighter Group, with its 3 squadrons, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, deployed, it went to Italy. It also served the 12th Air Force at first, and at first it was also flying those ground support type missions, air-ground support, flying P-39 aircraft, and then it switched eventually in June of 1944, a very important month in Tuskegee Airmen history, is when they switched from the P-39 aircraft, the 332nd Fighter Group, to P-47s, and they started the bomber escort mission. They transferred from the 12th Air Force, Tactical Air Force, to the 15th Air Force. The 15th Air Force was flying the bombers, and they were flying B-17 bombers, B-24 bombers deep into Central Europe. They needed fighter escort protection. Originally, the Tuskegee Airmen, the 332nd Fighter Group, flew P-47s to protect them. In July of 1944, another very important month in Tuskegee Airmen history, they switched to P-51 aircraft, the Mustangs, which were, some say, the best Allied fighter in World War II. They were faster, they could fly farther than other fighter aircraft, and they were excellent for escorting bombers. These are some of the bases that the 15th Air Force operated in central Italy, east central Italy, along, you see the Adriatic Sea there. There were 7 fighter groups in the 15th Air Force. The 332nd Fighter Group was one of 7, one of 4 P-51 groups. There were 21 bombardment groups. So there were a lot more bombardment groups than there were fighter groups. 3 bomber groups for every fighter group. Often there were a lot more bombers than there were fighters to protect them. And sometimes there were a lot more enemy fighters than there were fighters to protect all those bombers. So it's understandable that none of the groups had a perfect record, though the Tuskegee Airmen apparently had a better record than some of the other groups. Ramitelli Airfield is where they were based from the summer of 1944 through the end of the war in Europe, through the end of their missions in April of 1945. And you see there's a circle there, Ramitelli, and that's supposed to be a runway there. I'm going to show you a picture that looks like a mistake at first, the next slide. You see, it looks like it's not right side up. Well, I did that on purpose because I wanted you to see the viewpoint of a pilot who would be landing, coming back from a mission. The runway at Ramitelli was generally northeast, southwest. And the runway, there was just one runway, but it depended on which way the wind was blowing, whether they take off in a certain direction or land in a certain direction. But Ramitelli was the airfield that they were based at for most of the combat missions they flew. These are some of the important accomplishments. I mentioned the 15th Air Force. For the 15th Air Force, the 332nd flew 311 missions. Of those, 179 were bomber escort missions. 172 out of 179 bomber escort missions were without loss, without bomber losses. So it was a near perfect record. It wasn't a perfect record. The average numbers of bombers lost by the other 6 fighter escort groups in the 15th Air Force was 46. The number that were lost when they were being escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen, if you add up all the losses, was only 27. So it was an exemplary record. This is a picture of Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. with the chaplain, I believe, of the 92nd Infantry Group in Infantry Division in Italy. He was visiting the 332nd Fighter Group. And that's the plane that Colonel Davis flew, P-51, by request, because certain of the bomber pilots, some of them who had been forced to land by bad weather at Ramitelli, remembered the 332nd Fighter Group. And members of the 332nd Fighter Group left notes in the planes, "Remember us, we're escorting you." They were at different bases, and most of them hadn't known that some of their escorts were black. And so some of them did request escort by the 332nd. These are some other statistics. I mentioned some of them already. The 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses earned by the Tuskegee Airmen, and the Distinguished Unit Citations. A total of 3, one by the 99th Fighter Squadron and one by the 332nd. This is the kind of bomber that the Tuskegee Airmen were escorting, a B-17. And another kind was the B-24. And there were huge bomber formations. Sometimes there was one group to escort more than one wing of bombardment groups. So there were a lot more bombers than there were fighters to escort them. This is a very famous newspaper article. It's probably the origin of the never lost bomber myth. In March of 1945, the Chicago Defender published an article by a reporter that said that the Tuskegee Airmen had just completed their 200th mission without a loss, without losing any bombers. But the Tuskegee Airmen had already escorted bombers that were shot down by enemy aircraft in the summer of 1944. I think the reason why the reporter got confused and thought they hadn't lost any was because they hadn't lost any for 7 months. Between August 24, 1944 and March 24, 1945, there were no bomber losses. And so the article was written in March of 1945, and that story might have gotten around, but it wasn't factual. If you look at the records of the Tuskegee Airmen themselves, if you look at the records of the bombardment groups they escorted, if you look at the missing aircrew reports, which specify the groups, the squadrons, the planes, the serial numbers, how the plane went down, where it went down, how it went down, and when, it's conclusive. The 477th Bomb Group I want to mention too, because it doesn't get as much attention as the fighter pilots. The fighter pilots went into combat, they shot down enemy aircraft. They were well known compared to the 477th. The 477th was a bombardment group that stayed within the United States, prepared to deploy overseas, prepared to fly in the Pacific theater with B-25 aircraft. And they're not as well remembered because they didn't deploy overseas. But they are remembered for an incident that happened when they moved to Freeman Field. How many of you have heard of the Freeman Field mutiny? Okay, it's a very famous incident in American history, in World War II history, because at Freeman Field, the commander of the 477th Group, who was white, decided to establish 2 separate officers' clubs. And pretending that one of them was for trainers and the other one was for trainees, he really was setting up 2 racially segregated officers' clubs, one for whites and one for blacks. And the members of the 477th opposed that, and over 100 of them, 101 of them, were arrested for not signing that they agreed with the order that assigned trainees to one officers' club and non-trainees, the trainers, to another. And so they were arrested. They were eventually exonerated because even the Army regulations at the time said that if there's an officers' club at a base, all the officers at the base will be qualified to attend there, to go there. After the war, the 332nd Fighter Group took part in it was inactivated immediately after the war. The 477th continued. Then the 477th was inactivated, and the 332nd was activated again. And it participated in a gunnery competition. I think a little bit later I'll turn the microphone back over to Joe, and he'll show you a picture of the victory they achieved at the gunnery competition in 1949. And when the Air Force integrated in 1949, the 332nd Fighter Group and the 332nd Fighter Wing that was over it at Lockbourne were inactivated, and the personnel were assigned to white units, and that was the real integration of the Air Force. This is a picture of the second most famous Tuskegee Airman in history, Daniel Chappie James. Chappie James was an original Tuskegee Airman who trained during World War II at Tuskegee Army Airfield. But he continued to remain in the Air Force. He flew in the Korean War. He flew in the Vietnam War. Became the first 4-star black general in the Air Force. And there is a special center at Tuskegee University in honor of him. In history, the Tuskegee Airmen, there's a chapter in the book that talks about the Tuskegee Airmen in history, and I'll let Joe talk a little bit more about that, but I did mention that Chappie James was the first 4-star black general in the Air Force, but he wasn't the only one. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. was given his 4th star by President Clinton in the 1990s, and he became another black 4-star general in the Air Force. There's a detailed chronology in the book that gives all the dates that the aerial victories were achieved, that the units moved, that the DFCs were earned, that the Distinguished Unit Citations were earned. All the details about these events are in that chronology, and that's one of the reasons why, as Joe mentioned, this is an excellent reference work if you want information, details about the Tuskegee Airmen. And there's also a list of all the bases that the combat units served in, list of class photos, official emblems of the Tuskegee Airmen organizations, and a Tuskegee Airmen pilot roster, the 992 pilots who graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield. I'm going to turn it over now back to Joe. He has some more photographs to show you about the Tuskegee Airmen and their experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. One caveat to add to the Freeman Field mutiny. Talking to the late Bill Ellis and Bill Haulman, who would visit the agency, they and Al Groteman, of course, work with the integration of the Army Air Forces, or the Air Force. Sort of disagrees, goes off channel, but first-hand account says that Coleman Young, who's from Tuscaloosa, later become mayor of Detroit. He's a Tuskegee Airman. Because of his union activity in Detroit, he's the one that orchestrated the Freeman Field mutiny, and all of the credit is deserved. That goes to Coleman Young. That's a little tidbit. I thought you would like. But Jock Bullock from Phoenix City, and this is Jock. Notice how he appears to be separated from his unit there in France. It's about 1918, I believe. Dr. Frederick Patterson, third president of Tuskegee, and George L. Washington, the general manager of the airport and the aviation program there, and a bust of Robert Russell Moulton. In fact, I get correspondence from someone at Hampton about the Moulton Museum there. I plan to visit whenever I'm in the area. Here's a photo of the entrance to Moulton Field. The National Park Service has attempted to replicate this entrance. And this is, hold on for a minute, to the reason that we started this project, Jerome and I. We was getting so many requests for photos from the National Park Service. And later, George Lucas, the Lucasfilm people who are producing the movie Red Tails. And Jerome said, hey, why don't we publish these? So we approached Randall Williams in New South, and that's how we got started in this project. Dan had been working on the chronology and other information, and we brought him on board for the texture information. But kudos to the Air Force Historical Research Agency. We have an estimated 3,000 images of photos, and these are just samples. As Chief Anderson in the middle, right there, taking a break. And this photo, before Photoshop, had been doctored. They are not in the air. This is Eleanor Roosevelt and Chief Anderson. We have the original photo with a gentleman on the side of the photo. But this is a famous photo, but it's really been doctored. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt was a true friend to this program, and she was instrumental in getting this program started. And here's a photo of the Major General W.R. Weaver, who was commander of Maxwell, the Southeast Training Command. If you can see the writing on the bottom there, initiating the training of African American cadet and military aviators for the U.S. Army Air Corps. Notice the Booker T. Washington statue. Every time I see it, I think about Ralph Ellison, the Invisible Man. Mm-hmm. Anybody? First solo. This is a gentleman by the name of Alexander Anderson and his wife, Hattie Grimmett Anderson. And a co-worker of ours, Randy Anderson, loaned us these photos. Jeff Jakeman, who many of you should know, who did his dissertation, Divided Skies, right, introduced this story to us. Alexander Anderson came here from Pine Bluff, Arkansas, went through the civilian pilot program, was the first graduate, was quite an aviator, met Miss Tuskegee, fell in love. But when the program was initiated in 41, he was washed out of the program. He later continued in the Army and became a liaison pilot in World War II, flew helicopters in Korea. Him and his son served in Vietnam, retired as a sergeant major, one of the first black sergeant majors in the U.S. Army. There he is, again, in flight, in a Piper. Not only were there pilots, but there were weather officers, navigators. Let's see, what do we have here? Weather again. I love the design on the planes. Jay Ashurst, the artist, he likes that. Skipper Darling. But they didn't just prepare to fly. They entertained. They had a good time. Notice Noah Parrish gleam. Looking at Lena Horne. This is one of my favorite shots. There she is again. That's another shot. Storm and weather. I loaded it down with Lena. Thought I was there. Beautiful lady. And of course, local Montgomery, Nat King Cole, entertaining the soldiers there at Tuskegee and later Gottman and Selfridge Field. And we got the Henderson Orchestra, Bill Bojangles, Robinson, and of course Harry Truman, and we wanted to put him on there with General Spots. Truman is, of course, the one who issued the executive order desegregating the armed forces. And of course, he paid a price for us locals, the Dixiecrats in Birmingham, led by Thron Thurman. It's an outshoot of that desegregation order. And you can, for me, it tells me a lot of lessons, but I'll let you make your own about that movement, the Dixiecrats movement in '47. But Truman is really ahead of his time. And for me, his executive order and the performance of these Tuskegee Airmen initiated the start of the modern civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Later began in here in Montgomery at Rosa Parks, and of course the Brown versus Board of Education. So these are all key. And as Dan said, at one of the most valuable pure articles that we have at Maxwell is the Air Force Almanac. And a historian over in Atlanta named Elliot Orr kept calling me and said, well, who won that 1949 trophy? This is later would become the Top Gun Award. So we go over to Air University Library, went through that pure article in 1949. Unknown. Zelly kept pushing. We go to the 332nd wing history, and this photo appears. And there's the trophy for the first propeller-driven Top Gun Award. This is the 332nd. One is a local Alabama, I can't remember. And later, got General Metcalf at the Air Force Museum involved, and they went into their dark cubicles and found the original trophy, which is now on display at the Air Force Museum at Dayton. And of course, this is the biggie, where President Bush and Speaker Pelosi issued the Congressional Gold Medal to all of the Tuskegee Airmen. Not just the 992 pilots, but the over 14,600 participants. Women, men, whites, black. It's quite a story. And I had the luxury of working with Theophilus Johnson, who produced the database. He used our records to identify all of these participants. And the President and Congress used what we uncovered through the records there at Maxwell to award that gold medal. And many Montgomeryans are included: Sherman White, Richard Harris, Luther Oliver. The list goes on and on. It's a fabulous story.
And Roscoe Brown is in that picture.
Yes.
Right behind President Bush's shoulder there is Roscoe Brown, who wrote the foreword to the book.
So it's a wonderful story, guys, and we hoped you enjoyed as much as we did in putting it together. Thank you very much.
We're both willing to answer some questions if anybody has any questions about the records.
The lights come up if you'd like to take a seat or stand.
Sure.
It's time to take questions. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question and speak into the microphone so that it will be a part of the video. Thank you.
Thank you all for putting all this information together and putting it in a format that the rest of us can dissect and use in our everyday research. My question is about the database of 14,000. How does the public access that information?
That is, Dorothy, that's one of the frustrating things. Even the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc., they used to refer people to the website to purchase the disc. And I'll be honest with you. When Ted and Jewel Johnson died, I think 2 daughters and a son began to squabble over this database. And people would send money in, they wouldn't get the disc. It's called the American Experience, the Tuskegee Airmen. It's an electronic publication. I will contact the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. and talk to them about getting a copy of it. We have a copy because it was personally donated to me by Ted Johnson. I wrote the foreword to the study. And we use it every day to answer requests and information. Once this man, Tuskegee Airman, was my uncle, genealogy requests, information. So it's a valuable piece of work. I think they have a copy at the National Park Service site in Tuskegee. So, but it's quite a bit of work. Not only is there a list, but he also, if there's a special order or a roster or a graduation program, he's using primary source documents to document it.
When you look at the number of pilots and the number of non-pilots, there were only less than 1,000 pilots that graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield. But over 14,000, you can see there were a lot more ground personnel.
It was a self-sustained base. They couldn't, there was an incident by coming to Montgomery, getting in trouble. Going to downtown Tuskegee, being brutalized. You got to remember the era that you're living in. It's not like it is today.
I have 2 questions. One is in regard to the database. Is that not in the public domain? It should be.
It should be.
Are you talking about the list of 14,000?
What's that?
Are you talking about the list of 14,000?
Yeah, what he was talking about before.
I know it's in the congressional record. That may place it. And, of course, we use the Tuskegee Airmen, Inc. Roster in the book, of which they gave us permission to use.
Okay. My second question has to do with the DFC. What was that awarded for?
The Distinguished Flying Cross?
Yeah.
Okay, the Distinguished Flying Cross, unlike the Distinguished Unit Citation, was an individual award, and it was earned by pilots for various heroic actions. It was more outstanding in action than a lot of routine type military actions. It was one of the highest individual awards that could be awarded, and Distinguished Flying Crosses weren't given for just routine missions. They were outstanding missions that they had flown. And if you look in the chronology of the book, you'll see some of the missions for which they earned the DFC and the dates. In fact, every DFC is covered in that chronology. And I have to also recognize that there were others that worked on the research that went into that. I got a list of the orders that awarded the DFC, and I pulled every order so that I could see the date for which it was awarded. I didn't want to put the date of the order that awarded the DFC. I wanted to put the date of the action for which the DFC was awarded, and that was put in the book.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about General Davis. I was a young airman in Vietnam, and he came through for a visit, and I still remember how ramrod straight, and he was you know, my vision of a general officer at the time. And I think he was very successful, but he was a pretty tough cookie from everything I read. I just wonder if you'd talk a little bit about General Davis and why he was successful.
Well, the image that he projects, even he's in his late 80s when he's receiving his 4-star, he's still straight. I was intending to put the image on here. I had pulled it and just forgot to burn it. He is an amazing man. Can you imagine going to West Point and your classmates don't even talk to you for 4 years and surviving? That speaks, I think to me, that captures the whole story. He's obviously a leader. And when they deploy, I'm telling stories out of hand here. Dan and I have the honor of having the script of George Lucas' movie. The movie opened with B.O. coming out of the War Department. And the lines basically captures how he carried himself and how he defended his unit, even though the report said that they were not performing up to stuff in North Africa. That's where the movie opened. So I'm going to wait and let you answer that by going to see Red Tails in 2012, whenever the movie comes out.
and I might mention, as far as General, then Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., that in relation to the question that was just asked about the DFC, Colonel Davis earned a DFC, and his was for leading a raid on June 9th, 1944 in Germany.
Berlin,
and it was no, not
Berlin.
That was one of the first bomber escort raids. Was June 9th, 1944, and he got the DFC for that. And we have the DFC order. We have the DFC for all the awards, the 96 awards that were ordered, and people can come to the agency and actually look at the orders that awarded those DFCs and the action for which they were awarded. But he earned his DFC by leading that bomber escort mission, June 9th, 1944. I think it was only the second bomber escort mission that the 332nd flew in World War II for the 15th Air Force.
I noticed that your pilot roster is alphabetical. Is there anywhere where it's broken down by state?
No, it's alphabetical and by class. But I have identified like Pennsylvania or Iowa historian would write, so we can go through and isolate by state. But it's broken down by name and class number.
If you go to Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site today at Moton Field and look in the hangar, there's a map of where the original cadets who trained at Tuskegee came from. And they have numbers on the states for how many came from different states. And it's amazing how many came from southern states. A lot of them came from Virginia. A lot of them came from Alabama.
Wes Newton, Montgomery War, brought Sherman White to life for us. We did a mark-over on Wes Jeff Davis, State Norma graduate, University of Chicago graduate, Montgomery native. He was the first airman killed in combat. Charles Francis said he was down, aircraft collided on takeoff, him and James McCullough. We went to the missing aircraft report and found he was killed by anti-aircraft fire. He's a local Montgomery, State Normal grad. But the point that we should make here, these pilots are the cream of the crop. They're coming from some of the top institutions in America and HBCUs. They felt like they were carrying the weight of their race on their shoulders. They couldn't fail. Unlike other Americans, they would be judged not as an individual but as a group. They realized this all the way through.
I might mention, too, that as Joe mentioned, Tuskegee Army Airfield was the only base where black American pilots could receive their training for military service. But it was also the only base where blacks could train even if they weren't Americans. You know, we had a lot of Allied pilots that trained in the United States, British pilots, French pilots, and so on. And there were Haitian pilots who were black who couldn't train at other bases because of their race. And so they trained at Tuskegee. And there were some 5 Haitian pilots who also graduated from Tuskegee Army Airfield pilot training.
I see you had a picture of Chief Anderson.
Anderson.
Yes.
I'd seen him in a documentary on the Tuskegee Airmen on Alabama Public Television. Evidently, he was the chief trainer of the pilots. I'm just sort of
Civilian pilot training program. That's where he
it was
started.
a civilian pilot.
And he also worked over at Moulton Field in the primary.
Right. He wasn't at Tuskegee Army Airfield, but at Moulton Field.
Moulton Field. He was with the university.
Well, just as a curiosity, evidently chief was not a title, but his actual given name. Where in the world is one? How's one named chief?
That is, I don't know. That he's from Bridgeport, Pennsylvania, and he's hired by is it Dr. Moulton or Patterson that hires him?
Patterson. Yeah.
Patterson hires him, and of course the connection with Haiti and the Caribbean is all right. Moulton, who's flying all of these missions and liaison with the governments in the Caribbean, and of course the coastal defense comes up, and so they needed to train the members of the Caribbean nations. But that's the question. I probably can find it, but he was never in the armed forces. He never put on a uniform, but they just called him Chief Anderson for some reason.
Was he not the chief instructor?
He's right. That may be the answer.
Yeah, originally he was with the civilian pilot training, but he also, as Joe mentioned, participated in the primary training. The primary training was the first military step. And of course, when they advanced to Tuskegee Army Airfield for the basic and advanced training, that was all military.
That's the question for Roosevelt Lewis. He was a protege of Chief Anderson.